You are listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio.
You are listening to Christian Audio's production of Between Heaven and the Real World, My Story, by Stephen Curtis Chapman with Ken Abraham. This book is read by Paul Michael. Prologue. The Wild Mouse. When I was a little blonde-haired boy, my older brother Herbie and I loved to go to Noble Park, a 135-acre picturesque public property that includes a 5-acre lake in my hometown of Paducah, Kentucky. It was a great place where families could take young children, play on the playgrounds, have a picnic, feed the fish, maybe get chased by a goose, and just enjoy the beauty of nature. Years later, in the gazebo of that same park, I would kneel down before a beautiful young lady named Mary Beth, who'd stolen my heart, and ask her to be my wife. As a boy, one of my favorite things about the park was the section called Funland, a small amusement park that was home to cotton candy and popcorn stands, as well as several kids' thrill rides, like the ones you'd find at a county fair, that operated all summer long. Herbie was especially fond of the helicopter ride. Each helicopter held 2 passengers and had a control bar that you pulled back and forth to cause the helicopter to rise or drop as it circled around a large stationary pole. If you pulled that bar toward you, the helicopter soared higher, and if you pushed the bar away from you, the helicopter eased down lower, similar to the Dumbo ride at Disney World. As soon as Herbie and I climbed inside the helicopter, my brother pulled on the bar and the helicopter zoomed straight up as high as it could go. The attendant punched the start button, and the helicopter began going round and round. I screamed the whole time, terrified of heights, and tried to push the bar away as Herbie, always the thrill-seeker, pulled it back, laughing the whole time with that evil big brother laugh. I got off the helicopter, took several deep breaths to calm myself down, and searched out the little train that slowly chugged around the park. That was more my speed. We'd chug past the haunted house and the tilt-a-whirl, and I'd reaffirm my commitment never again to step foot on that crazy, spinning death trap. If you can't tell, I was a bit of a safety-conscious young fella, a condition my brother found great joy in exploiting when given the opportunity. Then life changed for all of us in Paducah the day the Wild Mouse arrived at Noble Park. It was our town's first roller coaster. I hadn't ridden the Wild Mouse yet and had no intention of doing so. Even Herbie wasn't sure about this one. But all my friends were talking about it. As I listened to their stories, I could only imagine the horror of that speeding coaster. Man, that thing is terrifying. You drop down this hill and you twist and turn, and I thought I was going to fall out for sure. I'd never been to an actual amusement park where real roller coasters ripped and roared around the track, so I didn't know the difference. I'd never experienced a grown-up roller coaster. All I knew from the stories I'd heard was if I valued my life, I should stay completely clear of the Wild Mouse. So I did. For a while. In actuality, the Wild Mouse was a little roller coaster car that could carry 4 kids, followed by a few other cars going around on a short track that had some small dips, bumps, and slight inclines. The cars weren't even connected, but ran in sequence. I should have known better. After all, the ride was named the Wild Mouse, not the Wild Dragon or the Wild Lion. It was the Wild Mouse, for crying out loud. Finally, the day came to face my deepest fears and stare death in the face of the Wild Mouse. I boarded with a prayer, and the ride began. I twisted and turned and dipped and bumped, screaming and laughing the whole time, and lived to tell about it. And if you had asked me back then, "Stephen, have you ever ridden on a roller coaster?" I would have pumped my chest and replied, "Oh yeah, I've ridden on the Wild Mouse." Fast forward a few years later to when our Uncle Barry took Herbie and me to St. Louis on Uniform Day at Busch Stadium. Once a year on that special day, kids could get in free to the St. Louis Cardinals Major League Baseball game if they wore their Little League uniforms. So Herbie and I packed up our Concord Lions uniforms and our ball gloves with hopes of catching a foul ball and headed to the big city of St. Louis. Uncle Barry did it up big time. We stayed overnight at a fancy downtown hotel, went up in the St. Louis Arch, went to the ball game in our uniforms, and ate hot dogs. Then the next day we went to a huge theme park, Six Flags over Mid-America, known today as Six Flags over St. Louis. We rode a lot of the rides and were having a great time. Then we got in line for the Screamin' Eagle, a real roller coaster. And not just any roller coaster. Oh no. When the Screamin' Eagle opened in time for America's bicentennial celebration in 1976, the 3-minute thrill ride was billed as the highest roller coaster in the world, with peaks up to 110 feet high, and the fastest coaster, with speeds of 62 miles per hour. Located at the back of the park on a bit of a hill, the white wooden track was even more awe-inspiring thanks to the cars decorated in red, white, and blue. I was ready for it. After all, I'd ridden the Wild Mouse. Herbie, Uncle Barry, and I squeezed into one of the cars after the Screamin' Eagle idled into the station. This didn't look so scary. I was perfectly fine. Until the roller coaster started moving. Like most coasters, the Screamin' Eagle chugged slowly out of the station, then began inching up the incline. Up and up. Higher and higher, with the clackety-clack of the wheels on the wooden track sounding more ominous every moment. The view was fantastic, but the higher we ascended, the more my mind screamed, "What have I gotten myself into?" We finally reached the top, and our car seemed to teeter there precariously for a second, or at least long enough for me to gasp for one last breath, and then, whoosh! The Screamin' Eagle lived up to its name, whisking us around a U-turn and then straight down, jolting, twisting, and turning as it went. I heard sounds of screaming all right, but it wasn't the eagle that was screaming. It was me, screaming like a little girl. It was downright embarrassing. But I didn't care because I was sure this was the end. The coaster careened around another turn and down another drop and then another and kept on going, tossing us first one way and then the next, with the wheels screeching loudly through every turn. The coaster track ran close to a forest with trees right alongside the railing, and at one point it looked as though we were going to smack right into a couple of branches dangling out over the track. But just a second or two before we became one with the branches, the coaster dove down a hill, causing us to miss the limbs. But my stomach was still hanging up there in the trees. The Screamin' Eagle kept right on screaming. My heart was pounding and my face was red, my body lurching one way and then another. I was holding on for dear life. I was sure I was going to fly right out of my seat at any moment. Herbie was going crazy, whooping and hollering, a thing we do in Kentucky when we're having the time of our life. His hands in the sky, loving every minute of it. And Uncle Barry was laughing all the way. Just about the time I thought I was going to lose my breakfast, as well as everything I'd eaten for the past few days, the coaster raced down several more hills, slowed slightly, and then slammed on the brakes, coming to an abrupt stop, pitching all three of us forward in our seat and then slamming us back again with a thud. Dazed, I climbed out of the roller coaster car and staggered off the station platform, trying to catch my balance and look strong in front of all the other kids watching in wonder, waiting to get on the ride. I felt pretty good about myself. After all, I had survived the Screamin' Eagle. The Screamin' Eagle was behind me, and I had conquered it. It was awesome. And best of all, it was over. I wasn't about to get back in line for that ride. But you can bet all my buddies back home are going to hear about how I took the Screamin' Eagle by the tail feathers and showed it who was boss. Before my Screamin' Eagle experience, I thought I had been on a roller coaster. But this was a whole different journey. Yeah, I'd been on a roller coaster. I'd been on the Wild Mouse. Life is like that. I know mine certainly has been. You live through wild ride experiences with some tremendous highs, some horrible lows, some hand-raising moments of exultation, and some gut-wrenching twists and turns. The cheers and the tears, like the experiences, are very real and valid. But then things or something happens that takes you far higher and much deeper than you could have ever imagined. And you realize that your wild mouse journey has suddenly jumped the tracks onto the Screamin' Eagle. A songwriter once wrote these words, "We'll travel over mountains so high, we'll go through valleys so low. Still through it all we'll find that this is the greatest journey the human heart will ever see. The love of God will take us far beyond our wildest dreams." Okay, I confess that songwriter was me, and the song was The Great Adventure. Even as I wrote those words, I had already experienced higher mountains and deeper valleys than I could have ever imagined as a boy riding those roller coasters. And I certainly had no idea how much higher and deeper the journey was going to take me. I'd love to take you on some of that journey with me, if you'd like to come along. I'm humbled and grateful that you'd take the time to pick up this audiobook, and I have to confess that even as I was writing it, I wrestled with whether my story is something I would want to ask people to take time to listen to or read. After all, my story isn't any more important or worthwhile than anyone else's just because I've had my picture on album covers and I've won a few music awards. It is my story, however, and maybe by listening to it you might be reminded of the importance of your own story. While I've woven my life and my story into the songs I've written all these years, my desire has always been to tell the bigger story of God's grace and His faithfulness, with my prayer being, God, I want to know you, and I want to make you known with the gifts you've given me and the life I live. My songs have always come from the places in my journey where I've seen more of who God is and more of my need for Him. I want to tell honest stories and sing songs about how God shows up in our real world. So that's what my hope and prayer is for this audiobook as well, that as I share with you my journey over the mountains and through the valleys, you might find encouragement for your own journey and be reminded of what's most true as we travel this journey together between heaven and the real world.
You are listening to Second Chance Ministry Radio.